Right. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, the first of many sessions you'll have this week regarding Rails. What I'm going to do during this session is basically show you how do you create a new Rails application and how we can make use of the acceptance unit test cycle to build our first feature with Rails. What we're going to be building today, well, is we're going to start at least building an application that will allow us to like list articles, more like a blog type of application. Okay, but we're going to do that BDD and TDD style. Okay, so I'm going to do this demo. I'm going to go from finish to start to end, show you how to do that. And then after this demo, you will get a chance to go through the instructions yourself. We have all of this documented in the course materials, so you will have a chance to do that on your own. But feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions while I'm doing this. Okay. Right. First thing you need to do, I believe Thomas and Faraz gave you an introduction to Rails this morning, what it is, and how to get started with it. But the first thing you need to make sure you do when to start using Rails is, of course, install it. It is a gem packet, a gem, a Ruby gem. So we need to run the command gem install Rails, which will first of all, install the executable on our computer so that we can generate applications using it. Okay. I already pre-installed Rails before this demo, so it will only show you, like, if you just do a fresh install of Rails, it'll probably give you like a more detailed list of gems that will install as part of this installation. Okay, but I already did that. And in order for you to get started with an application, you need to generate one. You need to scaffold an application. You get, as part of the CLI that comes with Rails, you get a command to generate new applications. Okay, and the command to do so is Rails new. So you type in Rails new, and then you give your application a name. So let's say app name. This is our application, and then it's going to generate a whole lot of files for us. That looks pretty much like the folder structure you were presented this morning, and then it's going to go ahead and do install dependencies that are pre filled in the gem file when you generate the application for you. So you sort of like get this generic structure on how to build your application out of the box, and then you can pretty much just open it. So when you run the commands Rails new and an app name, what happens is that it creates a new folder, okay, which you can then open with your text editor. Okay. But yeah, I just open it with my file browser for some reason. Anyway, but we're not going to use the default way of generating applications. The way I'm going to generate my application is by specifying a couple of options to what I'm going to generate. So my application is going to be called Rails demo, and what I want to do is tell the generator that I'm going to be using PostgreSQL as a database. Okay, and the reason why I do this is because by default, if we open this app name, you will see that the configuration for the database is making use of first SQLite on development, and it makes use of MySQL for production, which is something that will not work for us because we want to be able to deploy our applications later on to Heroku, which doesn't support those databases. Um, we mentioned earlier, and I mentioned to you guys earlier in the course, that the main database management system that we'll be using is Postgres. So that's why we need to do this. When we do this, it's going to make sure that the default configuration for our database is set up to connect with Postgres. Okay. The next option that I'm going to provide here is skip test. Rails also provides you with a default testing framework for writing unit test, acceptance test, and so on. But we will be using different framework for that. We will be using RSpec, and we will be using Cucumber for our various tests. So we need to skip the test generation when generating our application. Okay. The other thing that we would like to do is skip bundle, so that it doesn't run bundle install, because after generating this one, I want to be able to add the packages that I need, like RSpec and so on, to before I run bundle. Okay, so this is what we're going to do to override some of the default commands that Rails new comes with. You can use the help flag to see what other options you have available to this command. But I'm just going to go ahead and execute this one. And you'll see that it creates a couple of files for us. I'm just going to cd into Rails demo. And then we're going to open that with Atom. Okay. Right. Let's put this on the side. Okay. So this, I'm just going to put this here. Come on. Okay, so this is what we generated. You'll notice that we don't have a test folder as we would normally have if we had generated the default app. Okay, and if we look at the database configuration, we can see that we have some configs that are meant for Postgres. Okay, so that's all good. The next thing that we're going to do is, of course, with every project that you're going to be working with, it is important that you have some version control set up for your project. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is that when you generate a Rails app using the Rails new command, it sort of like generate, I think it does, or maybe not, because we have a git ignore here, but we don't have a git folder. Oh, we actually do. So the Rails new command will actually generate, will initialize a Git repository for you. And what you will have to do is, if I do a Git status here, we can see that none of these files are tracked at the moment. So you want to make sure that you track all these files at the beginning. Status. And then I'm going to commit this and say generate Rails. All right, cool. So now that I have that set up, you should go ahead and set up a remote repository for this project and make sure that you push constantly to that repository. But I'm not going to do that right now, and I'm going to move ahead to the next step, where we're going to set up, the testing frameworks that we will be using. We will be using RSpec, as I mentioned, to do unit testing, and Cucumber for acceptance tests. So what I'm going to do is add those gems to this gem file, but I'm going to clean it up first. Let's do that. So in my development test group, what I'm going to add are the following gem. We need RSpec Rails. We need the gem shooter matcher, because we're going to be doing some unit tests for our models. And we need the factory bot Rails gem. Okay, these are some of the gems that you've already made use of in the past. You've made use of the Rails gem last week when you were working with Sinatra. You also made use of the factory bot gem, I assume, to generate fixtures for your test, right? The only difference between the ones that you used last week and the ones that we're going to be using this week is the fact that most of these gems, you will notice that we have the dash rails added to them. The reason for this is because the specific version of these gems comes pre-configured to work with Rails. Okay, so they have all the default settings that Rails need in order to work with them. So whenever you, from now on, if you're building a Rails application and you need to make use of a gem, my recommendation would be to see if there is a specific version for that gem, because most of the time they will provide you with some easy setups, already pre-built with the gem. Okay, so those are the gems we will be using for unit testing. Once I do this, probably don't need. Okay, so I don't need that one, but what I need is pry. And of course, there is a pry Rails version. And then I'm going to add as well pry bybug, because we will be needing this for debugging purposes while we build the application. Sort that out. Okay, so now that it's up, I'm going to run bundle to install the gems. And I need to do some configuration of that. Right, so this will go ahead and install RSpec Rails, Shida Matcher, and all the other gems. Great. One of the main thing that RSpec Rails adds to the table is a generator to install RSpec for our project. If you remember, when we used to add RSpec to any project, we would have to run the command RSpec dash init, right, to generate the files that we need to use RSpec. But in this case, what we will make use of is another command. So we're going to make use of the Rails generator. So Rails has a command that you will make use of to generate a whole lot of things for your application, and it's the Rails generate command. What we will do in this context is use the RSpec generator that will install or generate all the files that we need for this application. And we can see that it created the .rspec file that we are used to, creates a spec folder and two helper file. Okay, we not only have a spec helper now, but we also have a Rails helper file. Okay, but I'm not going to go too much in details into why we have that now. We can talk about it during the week. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do, now that we have RSpec set up, I'll probably go ahead and add some extra configuration here. Say that we want some color output, and we want it to format using the documentation style. Okay. And now that we have that in place, the next thing we need to do is make sure that we set up Shida Matcher, right? Which was installed as well. So to do that, I'm going to go over to my Rails helper file. I'm going to clean that up a bit. So since you're new to Rails, it's often useful to go through these these comments here, because it basically explain to you what these files are used for and how you can configure external dependencies for it. Okay, but I'm just going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. So let's remove that. Okay, get rid of this one. All right. Oops. Now I need to add a configuration for Shooter Matcher. Do so. We're gonna have Shooter Matchers, capital M. And we're gonna configure config and config. It's gonna integrate with with test framework. And with library Rails. Okay. So this should be enough for Shooter Matcher. The other thing we need to do is that because we're going to be making use of a generator to generate things like models and controllers and route and so on and so forth, there are a number of default files that get generated with all these resources. I'm going to set up some configuration now to override the default behavior of that, because when you generate the model, for instance, it's going to generate test files for that models. Okay, all the different types of tests that are needed for that model. But in our context, we're not going to make use of all those default files. So I'm going to override that configuration by heading to my config and then the application.rb file, where I'm going to add right after this, let's say config generators. Right. And we just going to grab this for the sake of time. I'm going to put that here. Okay. So what we're saying here is that we don't want to generate helper files. We don't want to generate assets or view spec or helper spec or controller specs for any of the resources that we will be generating using the Rails generator. Okay. Because we will create those ourselves. Right. This should be it for our spec. If I now run our spec, should get this, which means everything runs just fine. Okay. I'm going to stop here to, first of all, make a commit for this configuration. I'm going to add everything, and then I'm going to say configure Shooter Matchers. Right. So now that we have that out of the way, we can set up Cucumber. In order to set up Cucumber, we first, just like with RSpec, we need to add a gem for that. So I'm going to add the gem Cucumber Rails. Then I'm going to add, so here, and I'm going to need the database cleaner gem. Right. So, oops, not that. There we go. We're on bundle install. And just like we did with RSpec, we are going to get, as a result of installing the Cucumber Rails gem, we're going to get a new generator added to to the application, which will allow us to install Cucumber. So I'm going to do bundle exec Rails generate. If you don't want to type generate, you can use a shortcut G, which will do the same thing. And we're going to install Cucumber. Great. So we can see that it created the configuration file for Cucumber, some scripts to execute the Cucumber on our project, generated a feature folder with the various files that we need for that. And then it also updated our database configuration file. Okay. If we head over to this config file, I'm going to clean that up as well, just to keep the relevant information. Good. Remove this one. Okay. This is what the configuration file for our database looks like. What this file does is basically set up the connection between our Rails application and the Postgres database that we will create for our application. And we have multiple environments set up for that. In those, you can see that here we have a little bit of a better organized structure compared to what we had last week, right? So we have development environment set up where the database name is going to be Rails demo development. And we have a test database that needs to be set up and a production database. This is going to be used when we push this to a server on Heroku or on custom server. And all these configuration file here, I mean, all the configuration for every environment is basically inheriting some config from the default config here. And in the default session, we set up the adapter to be Postgres, the encoding rules, and some other settings, right? For production, we have extra details such as username and password to connect to the database. Because it is production, you need to secure your database. And development and test, we don't care about that. And then as a last block, we also have a Cucumber block which inherits from the test configuration. Okay. With this in place, we can generate our database using a command similar to what you used last week. In order to create databases last week, you would run the command rake db create, right? You can run this in Rails, it will still work. Just the same, but we're going to do Rails db create. It's going to create both the test, right? I already have I should probably drop this before I continue because this is probably from previous demo that I've done. So we drop that. Now I'm going to create my database again. Then I'm going to run migrations. Already familiar with the concept of migration from last week. And you will see that it is even much, like the structure here is even much more better. There's a lot of things that Rails takes care of here for us. So we run the migration. Now let's try to run Cucumber. Bundle exec Cucumber. And this should, if everything is set up correctly, this should work just fine. And we get everything running. Good. So now that we have RSpec and Cucumber set up, we can go ahead and actually write some code for this application to do something. Okay. Right, but before we do that, I need to make this first. I'm going to commit this to say configure Cucumber And this should be it. Great. Cool. All right, before we move on to writing our first acceptance test and solving it, I just want to show you a couple of commands that you can run with Rails. In order to start the server with Rails, you need to run the command Rails serve, Rails server. And what this will do is it will start the local server on your computer. This is pretty much like the rackup command or the shotgun command you were running last week. Okay. You're gonna allow that, and if I pop open my browser, and I go to localhost 3000, you can see that we have Rails running. Okay, so this is how you start up a Rails server. Okay. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is the help command, which will show you all the commands that are available to use with Rails. Okay, so we've been making use of the generate command to generate or install some new packages on our application. The shortcut for that is G. We will talk about the console. The console is very useful when you want to debug stuff or try out things in the terminal before you put them in your application. We'll talk about that some more. Server is used to start a Rails server, and the shortcut for that is S. Okay, so if you do Rails S, it will start the server as well. Then you have test and test system and so on. Okay, and of course the new application. Now I talked about the generator. If we do Rails generate help, we will see a list of all the generators that are available for us to make use of. Okay, so you can use the generator. We just use the generator to install RSpec, both RSpec and Cucumber. Okay, but you can also use that to generate things like your controllers, your helper methods, your models, etc., or even your migrations. Okay, but let's go on and write our first acceptance unit test cycle. What I'm gonna do is, because I am very diligent with this, I'm gonna create a new branch called first AUT. Okay. Now in this branch, what I'm gonna do is create my first feature file that is gonna describe the feature that I'm about to build. And to do that, I'm gonna create a new file called list articles. Okay. This is nothing new compared to what you've been working with last week. Your feature files are going to reside in the same directory as they were before in Sinatra. You name them the same way. So file name and then the extension is feature. Okay. And then in the support directory, you will have an env file that basically sets up the configuration for Cucumber, and your step definitions are going to reside in this folder. Right, so nothing new so far. Okay, and I think this is one of the good thing with Cucumber is that no matter what framework you make use of, the setup and the folder structure is pretty much going to be the same. Okay, so if you learn Cucumber using Sinatra or Rails, you can use it with any other Ruby framework. Okay, right. So let's go ahead and describe our feature. So this feature here is going to be used to list articles on the landing page. Okay, so as a visitor, I would, right, so let's do it like this. When I visit the application's landing page, I would like to see a list of all articles. Okay, so this is the business case we're trying to solve here. And one scenario we could write for this is going to be view list of articles on the landing page. Okay. Right, we're going to have a couple of scenarios here. Given I visit the landing page, right, then I should see learning Rails, and I should see Rails is pretty awesome web framework. Okay. So these would be basically list of articles title that we have on our page, right? And we would like to see them listed on the landing page. Okay. So how do we go about implementing this? First thing we need to do after writing our test is, of course, running it. You're going to see me run for every Ruby command that I'm going to be running, for every command that I'm going to run using a gem, whether it's Rails or RSpec or Cucumber, I'm always going to prepend it with the command bundle exec. Okay. Reason for that is because the Ruby version manager that I'm using wants me to do that. Otherwise, it complains because of multiple versions of the same gem clashing between each other. When I do bundle exec, what I'm saying is that please make use of the version of the gem that is specified in the gem file of this project. Okay, so that it doesn't look into the global scope of my gems. Okay, and I have an alias for that on my computer because I type it a lot, and it's BE, which is short for bundle exec. So if you see me type this command, just know that it's bundle exec. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run Cucumber. And if everything goes well, I get some suggestions for step definition, as usual. Then I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to create step definition basic steps.rb. And then we're going to paste that in there. All right. So settings. Oh, we can leave that. So what is the first thing we need to do here? Given I visit the landing page, what are we supposed to do in this one?
Landing page.
What represents the landing page?
Well, the root path. Yeah. Just a slash.
The root path.
So it's slash.
Right. Right. So we can visit. So we can decide to make our / the route to our landing page, right? Because this is the first page that people will see. And now that we have that, let me just shut this guy out a little bit. Good. So we can run Cucumber again. And what will happen is that we'll visit the page, hopefully. But no, we get an error. Okay. So what it tells us here is that we have no route that matches the get action to this route. Okay. And this is something that is, again, I'm going to repeat this over and over again. Reading these error messages is very critical because it points you to the next thing you need to do. And then we see that we see some stack trace of where, how the error happened. And we can see that it is in the basic step at line 2 where we are trying to visit this route. So we're trying to visit this route here, but it tells us that there is no route that matched this. When you see this error, what is the first thing you think about at this stage? You know, what can we possibly do to get this error corrected?
Just create the route. I don't know. Seems like the simplest answer.
The natural thing to do would be to create this route, right? Now, the way it works in Rails, if you remember, in Sinatra, you had that controller file where you would define, you know, your actions like this, right? And then inside of it, you would basically have the action here. Okay. In Rails, things are a little bit more organized. We have a file that is responsible for, you know, handling all the routes configurations. Okay. And that file is in the config directory. File name is routes.rb. Okay. So what we're going to do is that to define this route, I'm going to put in some code here. I'm going to say controller for this route has to be named landing, and the action is index. Okay. Do not worry about the syntax just yet. We will have a session where I will talk extensively about how to generate routes within the Rails application. There are many ways to do that. Okay. So after adding this line here, if I go on and I run the test again, we should in principle get a different error message. And something went terribly wrong here. Right. It tells us that we have an undefined local variable index in this file. Right. Yeah, that is because this has to be a symbol. Okay. If I run this again, great. Now we have a different error message. Okay, initially we had an error that told us that, you know, we couldn't find a route matching this action. I mean, this get /. But now, because we get a different error, it means that we were able to hit that route, but unfortunately we found a different error along the way, which is that the controller for this action doesn't exist. Okay. Now, if you remember my talk from last week with the 3-tier architecture, I did mention that whenever you're building a feature or a functionality into your application, everything starts with a route, right? So once you have a route, that route needs to be associated with a controller, right? So you need to have a controller that will take care of all the processing that needs to happen whenever we call on a specific route. The way this was done in Sinatra is that we had that controller file where we had to list all the various actions that needed to take place for that specific controller, right? In the context of Rails, once you've defined your route, you need to tell Rails what controller is responsible for handling that route. In this case, I have a route path that is set to a controller named landing, right? And the action for the specific route is going to be index. Okay. Now, I need to, in order to get this error to go away, and the reason why we're getting this error is because we don't have a controller that matched this name. Okay, so we need to create a controller named landing controller. Now, in order for us to do that, I'm going to make use of Rails generator to do that. So I'm going to run the command Rails generate. And this time I'm generating a controller. Okay. And that controller has to be named landing, right? And in that controller, I want to create an action called index. Okay. And we're going to execute that. Now, what this is going to do is going to create a couple of files for us and some views. Because we said we want a controller named landing, it created in the app controllers directory a file named landing controller. And because I specified an action that I wanted with this controller, it also went ahead and created some views for that specific action. Okay. And it also went ahead and, like, by default, the generator will also create a route for the action that was just generated right now. But we're not going to need this one. I'm just going to comment it off for now because we already have a route that basically points to the same controller and the same action. Now, if we take a look at this file, if we open that up from here, every controller in Rails will inherit from the application controller class. This is a class that is defined as part of the Rails and has all the functionalities that, you know, Rails controllers need to make use of. And every route points to a specific action within a controller. So the get route path that we just created right now needs to point to an action. And the way you define an action within a controller in Rails is simply by defining a method, right, that matches the action that you specified in your route file. Here we said we wanted this to go to the landing controller and the action was index. For that reason, we need to create an index action. And what this will do is basically response to a get request to our route path. Then with that in place, without writing any code, let's go ahead and run Cucumber again. See what we get this time around. Right. Okay, now we get a green, which means we were successfully able to visit the landing page, right? Now we can move on to the next test. Any quick questions so far before I move on? All good? Great. Right, let's keep going. What we want to do now is that we have this next step, which expects to see some text on the page, and it's currently marked as pending. So we need to go back to our step definition, and I need to have an implementation here. I'm going to change this one to right. Can leave it a string, maybe, or perhaps I'd call this content. And here we're expecting to see a specific text onto the page. So the implementation for this will look something like expect page to have content. So making use of regular expression, we're going to extract a string from our step here, and that string is going to get passed to the variable content, and we can then use that variable content to write our expectation. Okay. Now, with that in place, I can go on to run Cucumber. And we should see some different errors now. And we, of course, do. Now, it tells us that Okay, we expected to see learning Rails in the view. So expected to find text learning Rails in landing index, find me in blah, blah, blah. All right. So when you read this error message here, what will usually be displayed on the side of the expectation is going to be the text that you specified in, in your step here. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, you will have all the text that is currently visible on the page that was rendered as a result of visiting this page. Okay, so when we visited this page, what was rendered on there was the text landing index, find me in the following. Okay, and nowhere in on that text do we have the text that we're expecting to see. So how do we go about fixing this error? Right, in order for us to display, we need to display this text on this page instead of the text that is currently displayed there, right? Whenever you generate a controller or a view with the Rails generator, what happens is that it puts in some boilerplate code on every view that gets generated, and it'll even the specific view that gets rendered here is the index.html.erb view of that is linked to our landing controller. Okay. So if we open up that file here, we can see that it currently has this markup in here, right? I'm sure you're probably wondering, how does it know which file to link to? Because we had a controller action here, and we don't even have a code. We have no code whatsoever in this method to say, hey, render the following page. If you remember in Sinatra, you would need to write a statement called this, a statement similar to this one, to say whenever someone visits this route, okay, I want you to render the following view. Okay. Now, what Rails does behind the scene is that every controller action, if you define a view, in the view directory that follows this convention here. So every controller will have a folder in the views directory matching the name of the controller. So in our case, we have a landing controller. That's why we have a landing folder in here. And inside of this folder, you need to put in all the views that will be rendered whenever we make use of an action within this controller. So if I have an action called hello in here, right, I need to have a corresponding view file within the landing directory named hello.html.erb. Okay, and so by default, what Rails will do is that it will look for a view within that folder structure. If it finds one, it's going to render that view. If it doesn't find one, it's going to complain and tell you that the view that is supposed to render is missing, and you have to create one. Okay, so you don't have to specify that action as we did in Sinatra. Right now, we need to modify this view to reflect the change that we want to see on when it comes to our test. So we expect to see this text here, but at the moment, this is what we have. So to get this thing to pass, I'm going to get rid of that text. And I'm just going to add, the simplest thing ever to get this test to pass would be to hard code that text. Okay. So when I do that, if I run Cucumber now, we should get a different error message. Okay, we can see that the second test passed, and we are also expecting to see another test there, but we don't see that. So I'm just gonna do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to maybe let's change this to an H2, and then we're going to have a paragraph with the following text. Okay. Now, with that in place, we should have, all our tests passing, and we do. Okay. So we just went through, implementation, our first implementation using the AUT cycle. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to commit this. First of acceptance test are green. Right. Good. Shall we take a 5-minute break before we continue?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Okay. So we're gonna take a break, and what we're gonna do when we come back is I'm gonna add some more steps to our feature file here to basically expect to view multiple articles on the page. And to fix that, we will go ahead and create some stuff on the database. And right. So I will send you a link in, okay, let's make it 10 minutes, and then we'll go over that. So you can grab some water and coffee. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.
Yeah.